So our gospel text today comes from Matthew 25, and we are once again experiencing another parable of Jesus, a teaching of Jesus. Parable means story, and so we're hearing this word, this message, and it's a pretty familiar parable. I just am interested in finding out how many of you are familiar with the parable of the 10 bridesmaids. Okay, how many of you, this is like the first really new to you, this story? Don't be shy, just raise your hand. Okay, cool, great. It's an interesting parable, and part of the interest comes right off the bat. The very first verse it says that this parable is to be likened to 10 bridesmaids, that the kingdom of God is to be likened to. Now, in the text we read today, it says like 10 bridesmaids, but if you look at some of the earlier translations, like King James Version, or some of those early translations, it actually literally says is likened to, which kind of gives us an indication that the community that's trying to recall this parable might not have it all together. And they're not sure of the source, in other words. And so they just want to let us know up front that this parable might be a parable that was shared by Jesus. It's definitely a parable that the gospel writer feels is important for the church. Now, part of that is, when it says likened to, it means that it might be familiar or similar to, but it might not actually be what the kingdom represents, which is kind of confusing sometimes if you think about it. But when you actually read the parable and you get into the parable, well, it does raise some questions, and we're going to talk about those in just a minute. But what we have to realize is when we're reading the Gospels and we're actually hearing these parables that were shared by Jesus, is that they're being passed on by oral tradition. In other words, a group would gather for worship and they would tell the stories of Jesus. That was the apostolic teaching. They didn't have these things written down. Matter of fact, when they did decide to write those things down, the very first gospel that was written, anybody know what the first gospel written was? It wasn't Matthew, it's Mark. It's Mark. Which is why Mark is so quick. It's very brief. When you read it, you're like, wow, man, he's not leaving out a lot of details. Jesus will go into a town and cast out some demons and heal some sick people. Then he's at another town and you go, wow, this guy's really getting around. I shared this story a while ago about my daughter when she was sick one time and she was in bed, and I was sitting next to her and I said, hey, do you mind if I read to you? And she says, yeah, that'd be fine. And I said, do you mind if I read a gospel? And she said, as long as it's Mark. I mean, Mark is this kind of brief gospel, and it's that way because the gospel writer wants to make sure that they can get as many stories they can down very quickly. And the gospel Mark is actually used by Matthew and Luke as a source. So there's all these sources coming around. They're having conversations. When they gather for worship, somebody would go around the room and they'd say, gosh, you remember that story of Jesus? I remember when he was down by the lake and his disciples were out on the boat. And so they'd share these stories and they'd pass them on, and they accumulate these stories and they identify which ones would be important for them to pass on. And ultimately, they had to determine which ones they wanted to record in what we now call the Gospels. And so we have this very interesting parable of the 10 bridesmaids, which the writer reminds us might be something like the kingdom. When you actually read the parable, though, there's a lot of interesting things, dynamics going on in the parable. Now, I can easily preach a sermon on being prepared by reading this parable. As a matter of fact, probably 99% of all the sermons preached on this parable is about preparation. Because at the core of the story is this issue with oil. Either you had enough oil or you didn't have enough oil. And so when the groom actually arrives and everybody wakes up from their slumber, some who do not have enough oil have to go find some. And so the message to you and to me is just make sure you're prepared. But I don't think that's the primary message of this parable. Matter of fact, there's some things I have some real issues with in the parable. The bridesmaids are getting ready because they're getting ready to receive the groom. Now, part of that is we don't understand the context of wedding ceremonies back there, do we? We think about our wedding ceremonies today. What happened was the groom and the bride would be separated from each other until that moment when the groom would come to meet his bride. And when he would come to meet his bride, there would be bridesmaids there to make the way for him to find this chamber where he could meet with his bride to consummate the marriage. And so that's where we find ourselves, is the bridesmaids are there to welcome the groom into this chamber so that he can spend time with his bride to finally consummate that marriage. And they're called to wait to be greeters and anticipate his coming to them. And so we find ourselves in that place. But there's another problem with the parable. Think about the bridesmaids themselves. Okay? First of all, they identify some as being wise and some as being foolish. The wise ones are the ones who have an extra container of oil. The foolish ones are the ones who do not. Right? And yet, when it comes to this point where the groom is coming and they sound the alarm, hey, the groom is coming! And those who don't have any oil turn to those who do and say, hey, can I borrow some oil? What is their response? No. Is that very Christian? No. I mean, it bothers me. When I read that parable, I'm like, what the heck? You know? I mean, if I have a little extra oil to share, I don't mind giving you some. Did y'all have that experience during the hurricane? Yeah? I had a lot of foolish people on my street. I had 2 or 3 neighbors knock on my door and say, hey, have you got any gasoline? And I said, no, go down and sit in line for 6 hours and get your own. No, I did not say that. I said, I've got a 5-gallon tank back here. I'll let you have a little bit so you can get by. Did you do the same thing? I hope so. You know, but not in this parable. In this parable, these bridesmaids are rather selfish, aren't they? As a matter of fact, when the others beg, please give me a little oil, they tell them, tough. Go down to the store where they sell oil and buy your own. This does not sound to me like Jesus, does it? You remember Jesus? The one who said if somebody asks you for your shirt, give them your coat too. Or if somebody asks you to walk a mile, go 2 miles. That sounds a lot like Jesus, but not what's going on in the parable. So already there's some interesting dynamics going on. And then there are the rest of us, all of us who read this parable. We think that this is all about that oil. And who's smart enough to have some, who's smart enough not to have somebody. But when you get to the final, the last part of the parable, you become aware that the groom could care less about oil. Never mentions any oil. As a matter of fact, the only thing that keeps those out is because they just didn't happen to be there. Have you ever got preoccupied chasing oil? Have you ever found yourself in your faith journey thinking that everything else was more important than actually being present and waiting for the groom? I have. And yet the message of the parable is about staying alert. And actually in some translations it says, maintain your station. Stay put. Be present. Don't leave. Because you and I both know that the grace that comes with the groom, this unconditional love, when the doors are open and the groom arrives, the groom is going to welcome everybody in. Who's there? Who's there? Whether you have oil or not. Isn't that a powerful part of this story? I mean, in its simplicity, it reminds us to remain faithful to the end. Regardless of our situation or our circumstance, regardless of how we feel about it, regardless of whether we're in a desert place or in the valley, in a low point in life, or on the mountaintop celebrating, be steadfast, be present, and the groom will lead us there. And another thing I think is interesting in the parable is I had always assumed, I don't know, until this week, and I studied this parable a whole bunch my whole life, I always assumed that the foolish bridesmaids were the ones that fell asleep. They all fall asleep, don't they? There's a lot of sleeping that goes on in the gospel, isn't there? I mean, think about it. In the parable, the bridesmaids fall asleep. Where else do we experience that? Jesus and the disciples, right? Jesus takes the disciples away with him to pray with them. He says, stay awake with me just for an hour. Pray with me. What do? Jesus sees them sleeping. He turns to them and he says, why are you sleeping? Can't you stay awake with me just for 1 hour? Oh yeah, Lord, we'll do it. They try. They fall back asleep. Jesus turns to them again. Come on. This is important. Pray with me. They say, okay, we got it this time, Lord. What do? How many times? 3 times. That's another important number in Scripture, isn't it? 3 times. 3 times they fall asleep. Peter denies Jesus 3 times. It's this idea that, we are imperfect people. Foolish or wise, with oil or without oil. We're all going to fall asleep waiting for the groom. But hold steadfast to that which you know to be the truth, in spite of yourself, for the groom will come. The groom will come. And the doors will be opened and all will be welcomed in. The question is, will you be there? So I got to thinking of some modern parables. Things that happened in my life and connected to the church or I was growing up that might resonate with you. Similar themes. I remember in 1984, right in the middle of the height of the 80s, the best generation ever. I was actually going to a dance down in Marco Island at the Marriott, which was the only big resort down there at the time. And some friends and I were going to go down to this dance, and it was a Lely High School dance, which some of you know my great love for Baron Collier. I don't love Baron Collier, just so you know. But I did like Lely. There were a lot of really cute girls that went to Lely. And so occasionally it was good to leave Naples High because everybody knew me in Naples High, but the girls at Lely didn't know me. So they didn't know I was a weird, creepy dude. And so grass is always greener on the other side. And so we found ourselves a lot more, at dances and homecomings down Lely than we did at our own school. And so we were going to this dance, and there was this one girl, her name was Jill, that I particularly wanted to get to know. And so we were at the dance, and I was trying to make my way to get to have a conversation with Jill, and she just kept avoiding me, and she'd be dancing with her friends, with other guys, and I was getting perturbed, and finally my friends came to me towards the end of the night and they said, "Hey Roy, you know what? A big group of people are going down on the beach and they're going to have a big bonfire down there. Let's go. Come with us." And I said, No. You all go have a good time. I'm going to stay here because I really would like to talk with Jill. And so they left, and half of the party left to go down on the beach to have a bonfire. Big cellar. That was back in the day when you could have bonfires on portions of the beach. It was really great times. And so I waited, and Jill left, and I was alone. And I had no idea where all my friends went, and so I got in my car and I left and I drove home. The next day, my friends got hold of me and they're like, "Roy, where were you, man?" I said, "I was waiting for Jill and I was looking around for her." And they said, "You missed it." I said, "Missed what?" He said, "We had this big bonfire at the beach. Everybody was there, and guess who showed up?" And I said, "Who, Jesus?" They said, "No, not Jesus, but pretty close. Bono and the Edge of U2. And I said, "What?" They said, "You missed it, man." I said, "That's my modern parable." I was searching for oil. I should have went with the group. I would have got to meet Bono on the Edge, right? The other story that came to mind was a few years back during Easter. We had begun what we call the passing of the peeps now, which is mass chaos now. But back then it was original and fresh, and so I had one box of peeps, and I had told people to bring peeps, but nobody brought any peeps. Y'all know what peeps are, right? Those little nasty marshmallow candy. We had to figure a way to get rid of them, so we started passing the peeps. But anyways, so I had one box of peeps, and I needed more peeps for the passing of the peeps. So I turned to Sylvia, and I said, "Sylvia," Dan Baptiste's wife, wave your hand, Sylvia. That's Sylvia. I asked her permission before I told this story, just so you know. I said, "Sylvia, can you run to Walgreens and get some peeps for us?" She said, "Sure," because she's a good, faithful servant. So she headed out the door, and she went to Walgreens, and we started the service. Easter at Cornerstone is big. And so we went through the service, big service. We got the praise band. We threw out our one box of peeps, kept on going, got to the second service, made it through the second service. Big, confetti cannons, and celebration. And the service was over, and Danny and I were standing in the parking lot, and I looked at Danny and said, "Where's Sylvia?" And Danny says, "I don't know." And then Sylvia pulled in. And I said, Sylvia, where have you been? She goes, I went to Walgreens and they were out of Peeps, so I went to Walmart and they were out of Peeps, and so I went downtown Walmart and they didn't have any Peeps. I went to every CVS and Walgreens and I said, what? And she goes, I missed Easter. There were wise bridesmaids and foolish bridesmaids. I asked her to do it. But it's about being present, right? It's about not giving up on our faith, or the community that we're a part of. You know, as a pastor of a church, I experience that a lot. You know, people go through trials and tribulations in the midst of their lives. We all do. And there's time and time again where somebody is either going through some traumatic event, some breakup, something happening in their life. And rather than remaining in the one place where they are loved and surrounded by people who love them, for some reason, they leave. Or they are embarrassed to come, or they feel like they're being judged by others. And I can't tell you how many times I've had those consultations and talks with people to say, hey, listen, if there's one thing you should do, stay connected with the church. And stay connected with the people of faith who love you and care about you, in spite of who you are, what you've done, or what you're thinking about yourself. And the good news, I'll tell you, because I've been here 21 years, I have had the opportunity to experience this happen in people's lives, which a lot of pastors that move around don't have that opportunity. Those who stick it out, even in the most difficult times of their life, and remain faithful to the community they're part of, and participate in worship together, in spite of how they feel in the moment. I've seen maturity in their life and their faith. The healing happens, but it takes time, and it takes persistence, and it takes presence. When we go out just searching for oil from other places, we miss the true healing that can occur right here.